All right. Was off my title slide there. Lecture number 8, we're going to talk about exchange of oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas between the blood and tissue. So in the last lecture, we talked about have these differences in partial pressure or concentration of O2 and carbon dioxide between the air and the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries surrounding those alveoli. And so now we've oxygenated the blood, we've taken the carbon dioxide out, and now we need to transport that oxygen-rich blood into the capillary beds of our tissues. Now you learned about that back in Unit 3, Chapter 19. And we need to deliver this oxygen gas into the tissue fluids surrounding your cells, and the blood needs to take up the excess semen generated by your cells due to cellular respiration. Okay, so the same thing drives that gas exchange between the blood and your tissues as drives that gas exchange between the blood and the air in your alveoli. It's going to be the pressure gradient, the difference in concentration between those gases in the blood and the tissues is going to drive which way they diffuse. All right, so if we look over here, oxygenated blood that the heart is sending out to your tissues, the partial pressure of O2 is 95. In an average tissue fluid, the partial pressure of oxygen gas in there is going to be about 40 millimeters of mercury. So 95 in the blood, 40 in the tissues. Well, which way is the oxygen gas going to diffuse as it's passing through those capillaries that supply a tissue? It's going to move by diffusion out of the blood and into the tissue fluids, and so your tissue fluids become oxygenated. All right, so that number is going to increase in the tissue fluids, and this number is going to decrease because the O2 has moved out of the blood and into the surrounding tissues. And in fact, by the time you get to venous blood, the partial pressure of oxygen gas in the veins is down to 40 millimeters of mercury. So it was 95 in oxygenated blood, and now it's down to 40 in your deoxygenated blood. And where did that oxygen go? It was taken up over here by your tissues. Same thing drives CO2 movement. If you look, let me erase all that. The partial pressure of CO2 in oxygenated blood is 40. The CO2 concentration or partial pressure of CO2 in your tissue fluids in an average tissue is going to be about 46. So as this blood is passing through the capillaries surrounding a tissue, which way is the CO2 going to want to move? It's going to move from where it's around 46 in your tissues towards 40 in the blood. It's going to move from higher to lower concentration. So that's what drives the pickup of carbon dioxide out of your tissues. And then if you look over here at your deoxygenated blood, you have a partial pressure of CO2 value of around 46. Some sources are going to say 45. I think your textbook actually says 45. So 45 to 46. And then you can see the numbers up here in the lungs, which is what we went through on the last video lecture. That's going to drive the opposite there. You're going to pick up O2 into the blood and the lungs, and you're going to release carbon dioxide into the air in the alveoli. Okay, a little bit more about how oxygen gas is transported to your tissues. Well, we actually talked about this back in the blood chapter, so this is mostly review. You guys already know O2 is carried by the blood. About 1.5% of the oxygen gas is actually dissolved in plasma. So gases can dissolve in fluids. You see evidence of that every time you open up a bottle of Coke and you see all the bubbles rising out of the Coke. Those are dissolved gases that are, because of the change in pressure, those gases are bubbling and being released into the surrounding atmosphere. So gases can be dissolved in fluids, your blood plasma, but 98.5% of it is, as you guys learned before, loosely attached to the iron atoms that are part of hemoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin, your red blood cells are basically bags of hemoglobin proteins. Hemoglobin consists of 4 proteins. Those are the bigger squiggles that you see there. And then you have, in the center, you have heme, and heme has an iron in the middle of it, and the oxygen gas molecules loosely attached to those iron atoms in the hemoglobin. So every hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 molecules of billions of hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell. No, gazillions is not a real number. I just don't remember what the exact number is. Now, that doesn't mean that every hemoglobin molecule in every red blood cell, once after it's passed through the lungs, has an oxygen gas molecule attached. It's not always completely saturated. If that was true, it would be called saturation, but that's not always the case. Okay, so what influences how saturated hemoglobin actually is? All right, so again, saturation refers to, all right, again, each hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygen gas molecules. So how much of that, how many of those spaces are actually occupied on your hemoglobin molecules in your blood? So we kind of casually say that your oxygenated blood goes to your tissues and just drops off all that oxygen gas. But if you go back and look at the numbers we were just viewing a moment ago, that's not true. The tissues don't take up all of the oxygen gas. In reality, under normal circumstances, only about 20 to 25% gets unloaded to the tissues. So the other 75 to 80% just stays attached to the hemoglobin and keeps circulating around. Now, this makes sense though. Let's say you have tissues where O2 levels have dropped. Why would O2 levels drop lower than they normally would? What's O2 used for? Good old cellular respiration. So anything that increases cellular respiration increases O2 use. So that will decrease the O2 levels in the surrounding tissue fluids because they're gobbling up more of the oxygen gas. So this makes sense. If O2 levels in tissues drop below the normal value, then more oxygen is going to dissociate or break off the hemoglobin and diffuse off the hemoglobin and out of the blood and into the surrounding tissue fluids. What this means is, since under normal circumstances you only give up 20 to 25% of your oxygen gas to tissues, if your tissues start working harder, like if you're exercising, you have lots of extra oxygen gas. You have a pretty big oxygen gas reserve, so you really don't immediately need to increase respiration or increase your cardiac output to supply those vigorously working tissues. You have a little bit of a window there where that extra O2 that you have reserved attached to your hemoglobin can supply those tissues. Some other things that can cause the O2 to come off of hemoglobin more easily: high temperatures. And if you've ever taken a chemistry class, you know that temperature refers to motion of molecules. The higher temperature, the more molecules are in motion, and the more things that are kind of loosely attached to each other, like O2 to hemoglobin, higher temperatures will make those things part ways more easily. Why would you have higher temperature? What's one of the things that increases the temperature of your body? Yeah, and you're probably thinking exercise, stress, hyperthyroidism. Remember that? Hasn't been all that long ago that we talked about that. But what's that associated with in the body? High temperature, increased metabolism, increased cellular respiration. A byproduct of cellular respiration is heat. As you break down nutrients, heat is given off. See, it always comes back to cellular respiration going on. So you better break O2 off of your hemoglobin more easily to supply it to your tissue, so that makes sense. Low pH is also an indicator of tissue activity, and the reason for that is, and just start thinking about this, increased CO2 levels decreases pH in any kind of fluid. CO2 functions as an acid in your body fluids. Just commit that to memory. It'll make your life easier, not only in this class, but when you move into your health sciences classes. CO2 functions as an acid. Acids lower pH. So lower pH in tissue fluids is an indicator that you have more. Where does this come from? Cellular respiration again. CO2 comes from the nutrients that you have broken down to supply your cells with energy to make ATP. More CO2 lowers the pH, and that's an indicator you got more cellular respiration going on, so you better unload some more oxygen gas to those tissues that need it. This is a graphical representation from your textbook, which is more or less just showing you on a graph what I just talked about verbally on that last slide. So on the y-axis, this is the percent O2 saturation of hemoglobin. So 100% means in all of your hemoglobin molecules and all of your red blood cells, all 4 O2s that could possibly bind are attached. And then it drops down to 0. 0% saturation would mean none of your hemoglobin molecules have oxygen gas attached, which would not be a good thing. So what they're showing you here is resting tissues. The partial pressure of O2 is usually about 40. And so when your oxygenated blood here, in the blood, in the lungs, it can become 100% saturated. And as that blood passes through the capillaries and resting tissues, it's going to unload that much oxygen gas off of the hemoglobins. So your percent saturation is going to drop to about 75% under normal circumstances. Then that blood is going to circulate back to the lungs, and it's going to become resaturated. It's going to go back to the tissues and unload that O2 gas, and it just keeps happening over and over and over again. But let's say in exercising tissues, the partial pressure of O2 gas is down to 18 in those tissues. All right, so when the blood enters the capillaries surrounding those tissues, this lower concentration of oxygen gas that you have in those surrounding tissue fluids is going to cause the hemoglobins to unload more oxygen. So the saturation in the blood on the hemoglobins can actually drop down into the 20 to 30% range when you are supplying O2 to exercising tissues. So that's just a graphical way of looking at what I just talked about. And I think I just talked about most of this as well. I was kind of jumping ahead. As cells metabolize glucose and other nutrients, organic nutrients, those nutrients contain carbon atoms. So the more metabolism, increased metabolism equals increased CO2. Increased metabolism lowers pH, and that's because the more CO2 you have around, the lower the pH drops. CO2 functions as an acid in your body fluids. Start committing these types of things to memory. Again, it will make your life so much easier. H hydrogen ion increase. If you guys remember from studying introductory chemistry in biology 201, pH is literally a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions that you have in a fluid. The more of them you have around, more hydrogen ions, the pH value drops. I know that sounds confusing. There's a mathematical reason for that that you'll learn if you ever have to take a chemistry class. But as pH values go down, you have more hydrogen ions around. The concentration of those goes up. Hydrogen ions are very chemically reactive. They interact with, they bond with all of our important biological molecules. So the concentration of those is absolutely critical. That's why pH homeostasis is so very important. All right, so a hydrogen ion increase means your pH is going down. Again, that's an indicator of metabolizing tissues like we have been talking about. All right, so that lower pH weakens the hemoglobin oxygen gas bond. You know, they're not tightly bonded together anyway, but at lower pHs, those O2s come off more easily and they can diffuse into tissues and supply those tissues. And as I mentioned, also at higher temperatures, like in exercising tissues, also the O2 comes off more easily and can diffuse over into tissues. When you see this term affinity, increasing temperature decreases hemoglobin affinity for oxygen gas. That's how strongly attracted they are to each other. That's what affinity means. It's like a magnetic attraction. So higher temperatures, hemoglobin and O2 are less attracted to each other. So the O2 comes off more easily and can diffuse into surrounding tissues. All right, homeostatic imbalance, hypoxia. We've talked about hypoxia before, but this can be considered an homeostatic imbalance of the respiratory system. This is where you have any sort of inadequate oxygen gas delivery to tissues. Tissues are not perfused with enough oxygen gas. This is a big time problem. Your cells are starving for oxygen gas. They can't do cellular respiration and they can't make their ATP. And if this lasts long enough, they're going to weaken and potentially die. Lots of causes of hypoxia. Some of these we've already talked about in previous units. Not having enough red blood cells. That's anemia. Not producing adequate hemoglobin. There are types of anemia where hemoglobin production is screwed up. Anything that blocks circulation, like a thrombus or an embolus. An embolus is a traveling thrombus. We've talked about that before. Atherosclerosis, cutting off the blood supply to tissues. That leads to hypoxia. If hypoxia kills tissues, remember, that's called an infarction, like a myocardial infarction. A portion of the myocardium in your heart has died because it's not receiving oxygen gas. It has experienced hypoxia for too long of a period of time. There are metabolic poisons that can cut off oxygen supply to tissues. One example of that is carbon monoxide, CO. The reason carbon monoxide poisoning kills you is because that carbon monoxide has a higher affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen gas does. And so carbon monoxide binds to it rather than your O2, and you wind up dying due to hypoxia if you don't get away from the carbon monoxide you're being exposed to. Pulmonary disease. So some of these pulmonary diseases we've been talking about, that makes sense. If you're not able to supply your blood with adequate oxygen, your tissues are going to experience hypoxia. And carbon monoxide, like I just mentioned, has a very strong affinity for hemoglobin, strongly attracted to it. So much so that it will substitute for oxygen gas and trigger hypoxia. Okay, in lecture number 9, we're going to, in that lecture we talked, mainly focused on oxygen, gas, transport, and release, and what triggers it. In the next lecture, we're going to talk more about carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is a waste, but as I've been harping on here, CO2 functions as an acid in your body fluids, and you guys hopefully remember from Biology 201 that maintaining proper body pH is absolutely critical to your homeostasis. And one of the key things that influences pH in our body fluids is carbon dioxide. So it's absolutely critical that you get this carbon dioxide waste that your cells are generating out of the body so that it does not screw up your pH. And you also have to get out just the right amount. Interestingly, if you exhale out too much carbon dioxide, that's a problem too, because that's going to cause your pH to rise rather than drop. So CO2 level, CO2 homeostasis is another very important aspect of the respiratory system, and so we'll talk more about that in lecture number 9.